little longer to bring it. We needed to still kind of get through the end of COVID, get ourselves just re-put together as a congregation, right? And so we've waited, and now it's going to come to us this fall during the season of Advent and be with us for a year. Now, I know that's a ways out, but this is just a little, little spring moment to anticipate a good thing that is to come into our lives.
Can I just add?
Please
we
do.
needed Elisa Brown.
Yes.
This is something that should involve our children very closely, and having a full-time dedicated person who can help us integrate the children at every age into this, I think was a very important piece as well.
You are a context person. So, Eric, tell me, so we're talking about manuscripts today. First, what's the difference between a manuscript and a book? And what makes the manuscript special?
So, book is a very general word. You're used to thinking of this as a book. This is actually called a codex. The technology in which we save knowledge in this form is actually called a codex. We just call it a book because it's a very popular and durable form of saving knowledge, but there's other ways to do it. Before there were codices, there were scrolls, and you might still, a lot of Jewish congregations will still read from a scroll. That was what books used to be. Before or even while there were scrolls, books were up here. When someone would recite the Iliad, they were reciting books that were never written down for thousands of years. They were books up here. So there's different ways to have a book. A manuscript, from the Latin, manus, hand, scriptum, written. It is a handwritten book. So not one of these, but a book that is written by hand. Printing with movable type is developed in the 1450s by Johannes Gutenberg. There's older block printing traditions. John Benson is here, can tell us all about that. They go all the way back to, I believe, ancient China, but the movable type, where you could set text into a page, then reset a completely different page. That's the 1450s in Europe. Before that, when there were books, and there were books for hundreds of years before that, they had to be handwritten. So a manuscript is a handwritten book. What makes it special? Imagine the work that goes into producing a handwritten book. The intimacy of that, the pain, the actual hand cramping, sore eye kind of pain that would go with writing down the Gospel of Mark, let alone the Bible. So it is a labor.
And also, for those of you that had to type college papers on typewriters, what happened when you got 3/4 of the way down the page and you left off a word or made a mistake? Kind of a nightmare. You rip the paper out, right? But manuscripts are on paper.
Yeah.
What are they on?
They're on parchment. They can be on paper, and toward the end of the Middle Ages, they were increasingly on paper, but mostly paper was something that Europe at least came to rather late. Paper existed before there was, well, the ultimate answer is parchment, and parchment is the skin of an animal, a calf, a sheep, usually those are the two favorites, occasionally a goat. But they were printed on animal skins that were specially treated. It's not a tanning process the way you'd make leather, but it's not unrelated to that. And it leaves a very durable, creamy white surface on which you can write on both sides. Before there was parchment, there was papyrus, but you can only write on one side of that. So parchment has an advantage in that you can write on both sides.
So when they went to make John's Bible, they made the decision to do it on parchment, though they could have had access to any quality of paper on the planet.
The idea behind the St. John's Bible, in part, was to use centuries-old techniques at the highest possible level. I guess they used computer-aided drafting in terms of page layout and figuring out how many words you can fit on this line so that you know about how far you're going to get before you get to the next page. Before we get to the St. John's Bible, though, I want to think back to what we just did and where we were and how many books were in that space. You came in and you sat down in a pew, and within your immediate reach, there were 3 books in all likelihood. There would have been a Bible, a Book of Common Prayer, and a hymnal. And if you move over a few feet, there's another set, and another few feet, there's another set. And everyone who walks into the church has those 3 books immediately to hand. Before you even got there, you were handed a pamphlet, which is really a digest of what's in those books. And then when the church service started, there's a procession, and there's the verger, and there's the choir, and there's the Eucharistic ministers, and there's the book, the big, and outside Lent, silver-bound book that contains the Gospels. Books are central to how we worship. And one of the things I learned, and we do have our particular periods. I'm a 16th and 17th century man, which means I live in the age of printing. I know an awful lot about how printed books were produced in the 16th century. I know very little about how there are divides in history, and one of them is that 1450s where there's printing and then there's pre-printing. I didn't know much about how manuscripts were produced, so I did what historians do. I did a little research. I got myself a book. I recommend this book, The Medieval Scriptorium, Making Books in the Middle Ages by Sarah Charles. Wonderfully accessible to a non-specialist audience, fully erudite for a specialist audience, but a very readable account of really the beginning of manuscript production in a Christian tradition. And it goes back all the way to the beginning. We are people of the Word. We are people of the book. And in order for that to be the case, it wasn't good enough to just have it up here. Oral history is wonderful, but it's also quite flexible. That's a strength. But if what you're trying to communicate is the revealed Word of God, it can be a weakness. The Word needed to be recorded. You do that with writing. Every parish converted, every village that comes to Christianity has to have its Word in preserved form, and that means books. They needed to produce books. They needed to mass produce books, and they needed to mass produce them by hand, one letter at a time. The other thing that came, so part of Sarah Charles's point is that the beginning of Christianity and the beginning of manuscript production operate in tandem. Book production develops because the Christian community needs those books.
Was the Word.
In the beginning was the Word. And that is literally true in the Christian tradition of conversion. When Paul and the apostles are going out to convert the Mediterranean basin across the Roman Empire, they're bringing the Word with them, and it looks just like this, except it's handwritten. The other thing is that handwriting in the ancient Greek and Roman traditions is scribal work. Writers, authors, those were the learned elite. The scribes who copied it, that was grunt work, and that was mostly slaves. So in the Roman Empire, someone who copied a book would have almost certainly been an educated slave. So one of the things that you want to bring out here is that when monasteries full of monks and nuns, and it was men and women, though we've largely written women out of this, when men and women gathered in intentional communities, one of their most important jobs was to produce and reproduce the Word. When they're doing that, they're taking up the work of slaves. So this is taking up their humble cross. It's devotional. It's prayer. And it's also, again, the importance of it is vital to spread the Word, but the work they're doing is scribal. It's slave work. It's humble. It's service. Service to God, service to fellow men. So that's the beginning of this tradition, this manuscript tradition.
Yeah, what a quiet and powerful evangelism.
Yes, and evangel, to spread the good news.
Yeah.
That is what they're doing. And it doesn't stay there. The work of copying the Word of God becomes an exalted role. But that's not, the humble communities that began this were doing the work of slaves because someone needed to do it. And they needed to do it quickly and in mass quantities. But in a world where you can't mass produce anything yet, it's all done by hand.
So we have existing manuscripts. But how much do we know about how they were made?
We actually know, there's things we know a lot about, and there's things we know almost nothing about. We know a fair amount about scribes, and this is because scribes had, well, they held the pen. And so in amongst the revealed word of God, which they will put on the page, when they get to the end of the book of Isaiah, there may be a note added that says, "Thank God I'm finished with this. I'm freezing to death. I'm starving. My hand hurts so much." So we know some of what the scribes themselves occasionally tell us about their labor. They were devoted, but they felt the pain of bending over a desk, handwriting something, the physical pain of that after 10 hours. It's at least as much in its way what you get from working in a field for that long. The mental anguish and pain of that. Imagine concentrating. You're not writing. In some ways, writing is easier. You're copying. It has to be perfect. It's mindless, but requires absolute concentration at the same time. And we know this because they tell us this. We have occasional images. Most of these manuscripts, especially after the very early years, were illuminated. I shouldn't say that. They were illustrated. Illumination means specifically they add gold and silver leaf to it so that it glimmers, it glows. Painted, they were illustrated. And often they would illustrate themselves. So there are pictures of scribes writing, pictures of illustrators painting. So we know a bit about that. What we don't know much about, the idea of the medieval scriptorium, the dedicated room in the monastery where the monks would gather on a daily basis to do their labor, produce these books in a room together. There's very little evidence that these things actually existed as such. They may have, but we don't have any images of, say, a dozen monks working in a dedicated room. We usually have one, at most two people working in any of these images. So we don't know if there was a dedicated room. There may have been. There's some evidence that says yes, but nothing definitive. More likely, you'd want to picture them right out there. We think that they probably did most of this work in the cloisters. So if you visited a medieval cathedral, and a great many folks in this room have, probably many of them, if you're involved in the choir at all, there's a courtyard with a cloister, usually open to the elements, and that is, we believe, where they would have done this work. There'd be wooden stalls that were set to divide them with desks, but they complain about being outside. They complain about the fact that it's cold, that the light is failing. That's how you want to picture them, is sitting in desks along a cloister, not unlike that one, rather than in a room like this.
When you say that, I'm imagining the size of the manuscript they're creating and the size of the one they're copying off of are really, really large. Now, if you're like me, you're going to struggle to see the top of that page way up there on the one that you're copying from. And that's even me in a really well-lit room. So that add to all of that, but eye strain, and you're not copying something that's this close. These pages are really huge.
A folio page is about this big. So yeah, you get the skin of a good-sized animal, a cow, a calf, or a sheep. You can make maybe 4 folios out of this. The folio page is about this big. The front of it is recto in Latin. The back of it is verso, the reverse. They wouldn't have had page numbers, by the way. They still don't. Often roll into the printed era. You talk about folio 37 recto, 37 verso. Page numbers that come a little bit later. These are 13th century. They were producing these things for 1,000 years before the 13th century without any corrective eye wear at all. So it's very hard on the vision. When you're nearsighted, you have to get closer and squint, which was what they would have done. Yep, the farsighted, you're doing that. And obviously you come to a point where you can't do that work anymore. So the younger monks would take over, the younger nuns would take over. You might be promoted to librarian, where you could kind of oversee the activities of all the scribes, but you would not be doing the fine copy work yourself. Or arthritis. It's not like they've got aspirin. After you've done this for 10 hours every day for 15 years, it does play on the joints as well.
In the production of these manuscripts, there's a whole lot to going into making the ink and the quills, and it's easy to imagine maybe after you can no longer do this, you are now kind of producing the materials.
You might be certainly keeping the materials.
Yeah.
Often they made their own materials often, at least the paints. The artists would mix their own paint. One thing I wanted to be sure to mention too is how intimate this all is, and remains so for a reader in the 21st century. It's handwritten text. You can recognize handwriting. We know that some of the monks were itinerant because we can recognize some of their scripts, some of the little quirks in their scripts that came out of different monasteries. And so we know that some scribes would have moved from one monastery to another because we can tell from their handwriting. If they made a mistake, they didn't throw the parchment away. That was ridiculous. It was expensive, and not to mention the labor in it. So you might cross something out or make a little, if you skipped a line, you might interleave it down at the bottom, and then you'd draw a little fancy filigree that would show that this is where the line goes. So there's a very real human nature to this, but also the intimacy of the materials. These were animals. They would have come from the herds of sheep and cattle that the monasteries themselves kept. You knew this animal. You could see where it was bitten by flies. The parchmenters would be able to take a lot of that out. But you can still see the pores in the skin of the animal when you're reading these things today. They would have had paintbrushes that the hairs were made of squirrel tail hair. The pen that they're using is a goose quill, the geese that are wandering about the monastery that lay eggs and are used for meat. They also shed their feathers in the summer, and that was what they would use for the quills. The pigments that they would use for the ink would have come from oak galls, which is a bizarre phenomenon I learned about from this book. Wasps lay their larvae in the branches of the oak tree. The oak tree thinks it's damaged and grows a sort of a bulbous thing around it called a gall. It's full of tannic acid. And if you harvest those, the tannic acid, when you mix it with iron vitriol, I'm looking at John because I'm guessing he knows a lot of this. Iron vitriol creates a very strong, an intensely inky black. And both of those are native throughout Europe. Gum Arabic uses a fixer to make it stick and not smudge. That doesn't come from Europe. So there's some things you have to access from far away. That's from North Africa, more the Mediterranean. So if you're in Ireland or northern England, you've got to work to get that stuff. Pigments might be madder or woad, which would grow in your own garden. That was common variety stuff. But if you want the really nice reds and blues, you've got to get lapis lazuli, which comes from Afghanistan. You want to get cinnabar, which comes from volcanoes. So you have to have extensive trade networks to get these very, very precious things. But most things you could produce locally. You would have known the animal that produced the skin that you're writing on now.
Well, how necessity and creativity drive innovation. It's really neat to think about all of that. It's exciting. Are there any things we still don't know about the process, despite having produced this manuscript, the St. John's Bible? What are the mysteries?
There's always things we don't know. We don't know about a scriptorium. Was there ever such a thing as a scriptorium? There's one surviving plan of a monastery that does have a dedicated room that's labeled scriptorium where they wrote. We don't know if that monastery ever actually existed or if it's sort of an idealized plan of what we'd like to have. We know that most existing monasteries that did get built and either the monastery or ruins of the monastery survived don't seem to have that. So that leaves a lot of mystery about how this work process took place. There's always things we don't know, and often we don't know what we don't know. But I think that was part of the move to do the St. John's Bible is to why would you do this thing? How hard is it to come across a Bible? And maybe you want a really fancy Bible. Okay, but printing one would be comparatively simple. Why would you deliberately skip back 500, 600 years of history and technology to produce a handmade Bible using thousands of years old technology? Part of it's to learn what that was like.
Just I have to ask, did they think left-handed people worked in scriptoriums?
Oh, that's a great question.
Because, you know, I mean,
What was the question?
lefties, did we have any role in this? Because you know how we are. If we're writing something, we smear the page, right?
Unless you're writing backwards.
I know.
Which is how Leonardo da Vinci did it. He wrote, da Vinci either wrote this way, or he wrote, and there's a lot of his surviving manuscripts where he's writing backwards. It's mirror writing, and a lot of left-handers, not a lot, some left-handers taught themselves how to do that so they could write a mirror image and then read it. I don't know if you would have been probably you would have, a left-hander would not have probably been in the scriptorium as my guess.
Think about the arthritis lefties would get if
Yeah.
they had to do this the whole time they wrote it.
We
It's
don't
hard
know.
to-
One of the things we don't know.
They just left us in the kitchen. We'll just assume that for now. So to kind of move a little bit to the St. John's Bible.
So I've had the great blessing of being able to see not just the project, but, and I guess they're no longer doing this, unfortunately, but we were allowed into the vault to see the actual manuscript pages, the vellum, the parchment on which the scribes and the illustrators and the illuminators have done their work. And I guess I shouldn't skip over illumination either. They have to make a glue called, I'm blanking on the name of the, it begins with a G. It's a particular kind of glue that you'd stick the metal leaf to. It's made of the most foul-smelling stuff. There's both excrement and urine in it. And it would have smelled terrible. And then you have to take this gold leaf, which has been pounded to the point where if, like, they had to work in curtain-lined cubicles because if there was any breeze, it would make it impossible. It was so fine it would blow away. But all of this work, and there were maybe 24 craftsmen, scribes, illuminators, and illustrators who worked on this project collaboratively. You can see the different handwritings. Again, there's the intimacy there where you can tell where one scribe left off and another took it up. St. John's Bible,
Yeah.
yes. That's something that's just never going to change. Donald Jackson, it's Jackson, correct? Yeah, Donald Jackson, who is the director, the artistic and sort of intellectual director of the project, invented a new script, and the scripts evolve over time. He developed a new script for the Bible. The translation they use is the same one that's upstairs, the Revised Standard Version, New Revised Standard Version. That's the text that was used. So it's an English language Bible, which gives it a sort of a 16th century printing heritage. But that project of collaborating between scribes and illustrators. One of the stories that really stuck with me for no particular reason is they picked certain passages they wanted to highlight as illustrations that were particularly meaningful. And it was actually the illustrators who came back to Donald Jackson and the scribes and said, would you like us to do that with the Lord's Prayer? You didn't highlight that as one of the things you wanted us to illustrate. Would you like us to break that? Well, yes, absolutely. So very much a collaboration where the illustrators were actually saying, don't you want us to do an illustration of this occasionally? Yeah, we do.
One of the things that struck me when we were there, I mean, so many things, was his acquiring the ink.
Yeah. The ink is, so it looks like a charcoal briquette, the ink. It was from China. I don't know whether it was carbon-based ink or the oak gall ink.
It struck me. It was made out of honey and candle smoke.
Okay, so it's carbon-based in this particular case, not
Yeah.
the oak gall.
So that, like the blackness, like if you burn a candle too close to a wall and you get a black smear on the wall, right? It's soot. So in China, they would collect this soot, combine it with honey, and create these cakes of ink. And he was a boy.
Very durable, very portable.
Yeah, but pricey. So he was a boy, and he was 13 or whatever, going past a print shop, and they were clearing them out, just selling these things for pennies on the dollar, what they were worth, really. And
Who needs this stuff today?
he bought it,
Yes, I could.
but he bought it, and he said, someday I'm going to do something with this. I don't know what it is. And he held them, and he kept them for decades until he knew this was the project that he would use them on. Now, I think I think they told us if you were to try to buy one of these, and they were actually kind of like domino shaped,
Yeah.
even smaller than a briquette. I don't think, I mean, what would it cost? Thousands of dollars. And he got them for a song and just had this vision and this dream. I'll have Colleen send out a link to a video about him.
Yes. it's
So you
worth
can
watching. It's
see
8 minutes
him.
long.
It's great. You can see him working on it.
He's the illuminator to the royal family. So whenever there's something that the royal family produces, a birth announcement where they want a proper manuscript, illuminated version of it, he's the guy who does that. And it was his dream to produce a Bible. And the St. John's Monastery was interested in this project and agreed to support the work. He was the artistic and I really the intellectual project director. So he's coordinating the scribes and the illuminators and the illustrators, and I think he can do all of those things himself. But again, about 24 people all told were involved in this. And we have a few images, including a page of text. But this one is my personal favorite, I think, of what I saw. This is the creation story. One of the things that they stressed about this is they wanted this to be, they're not thinking about the year 2100. They're thinking about the year 3000. This is a priceless work of human endeavor using technology that is 1,000 years old, but that is going to survive another 1,000 years or 5,000 years, just as some of these manuscripts we have today have survived, Bibles not least among them. How do we communicate across 1,000 years? What will still have meaning? They got to pick a language, and so they picked what they thought was a very accessible English language translation of the Bible, but they wanted the illustrations in particular to be as accessible as possible. Some cultures don't like to represent God in the flesh. They actually deliberately avoided that. God is throughout the book, but not necessarily in the way that you'd expect. So this is the creation story. The thing you're missing, you see the little squares that are in lines, very neat geometric lines across. Those are actually illuminated. So that's gold leaf. And you can't quite get the way that appears on the slide. It looks like yellow. It should look like gleaming gold metal because that's what it is. When we get the book, it will. When they made the prints, they preserved that aspect of it. So you can see it progressing from chaos to order, separating light from dark, or creating light and dark, separating land from water, making night and day. If you look at the 6th band there, that is the creation of man and woman. Those are based on cave paintings that are 40,000 years old. And again, they try to be multicultural in the production of this, to draw from all of the wealth of human artistic creation. There are dozens of different cultural traditions that are represented in this Bible because it had to speak to anyone that might encounter it. But you get there's one square at the top, then 2 squares, 3 squares, 4 squares, and in the middle there's the dove. Not represented, really. It could be a black bird flying across, but the interpretation I liked better, it's a shadow. What you're seeing there's the shadow. So it's really kind of, it's the problem of describing a picture in words. But this is meant to be the creation story in a single image with so much going on. You could stare at this for an hour and see different aspects of what's going on. Can we go to the next slide as well?
I'm going to kind of say one
Yeah,
thing
please.
about this. So one of the ways in which you interact with an image that we will get to engage in once we receive the volume that will come to us, which is the New Testament, the Gospels and the Book of Acts, is something that we call Visio Divina. So it is examining the image with your heart. What is it saying to you? what do you see in it? And, we'll get to spend time with things like this. If we were doing this, I might say, why is the last band on the right gold? What is that telling us about what God was doing in creation? What is the seventh day? The day of rest.
And it was good.
And it was good. And what should we do on the seventh day? We glorify God, right? So we'll have time with this to get to do this kind of divine reading of the heart with the materials. So I'm going to advance the slide.
So it's a 7-volume work, and we're going to be getting one of the volumes, which is the Gospels and the letters, or Acts rather, which is got wonders plenty in it. It's a shame, the other 6 have their own wonders that we get to see bits of. One of my favorites was the Valley of Dry Bones, which had an elaborate illustration. God is gold, God is light, and God is rainbow often through the course of the book. So the Valley of Dry Bones was portrayed as a junkyard. There's elements of the junkyard in it, but then it kind of, from one side of the image toward the other, it fades toward the graves from the Holocaust, the mass graves. So it's a very dark image. It's one of the darkest images in the book. But in the junkyard side, there's an oil slick with a rainbow in it. So just the slightest hint that even here there is God. That one really, I stared at that one for probably half an hour. This is just a page of text. So this is what the book itself looks like, the handwritten text. It looks teeny tiny, and you can't read that possibly from where you're sitting, because I can't read it from here. But you want to be picturing a page this big. It's very easy on the eyes when you're faced with the item itself. This is just a slide where it's been shrunk. But note the illustrations here. So this is Gospel of Mark. There's a bit of commentary in the side there. I don't think there's any mistakes on this page, but there are pages where you can see the scribe has skipped a line and has had to figure out some artistic and often rather humorous way of getting that line back in there.
Which they didn't do on purpose, by the way. They weren't trying to recreate the kind of mistake that would have happened in an ancient manuscript. Mistakes happened.
Mistakes happen.
And then they had to be creative.
You're copying hundreds of pages of text by hand, and you're gonna miss a word. You're gonna skip a line. Imagine again how your 7th hour of concentrating, you're not what you are in your first. But the illustrations here I love. They're throughout. St. John's is located in central Minnesota. They're the ones that agreed to sponsor this project and see it through to completion. And in honor of that, the illustrations are a celebration in part of the northern Minnesota native flora and fauna. So there are white-tailed deer, and there are beavers, and there are, as you can see, monarch butterflies. It looks like something out of a naturalist volume. If I saw that in a 17th century natural history volume, it wouldn't surprise me, but it's not. It's in the Bible. It's in the Gospel of Mark. And there's symbology in it. Again, you've got the cocoon and the new birth of a butterfly from the chrysalis. There's all sorts of religious symbolism and imagery in that, but it's also an animal that you'd see if you were wandering in the woods of northern Minnesota. And the Bible's filled with that kind of imagery, which makes it feel, again, very intimate, very local, very, very much a human endeavor.
It shows how much the people that were illustrating this had to get to know the environment they were working in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Which
a lot of the scribes are British. So.
Right, which would mirror like the people working in the monastery
Yeah.
who were from that place would have known their landscape that intimately. And so they took on that. They didn't just paint British butterflies.
No, they deliberately didn't paint British butterflies. This is a project that lives in central Minnesota. It was in some ways born there, and it is of there. That was very important to them. So a lot of when you see critters, and there are critters throughout the Bible, that is what they're illustrating. They're trying to think very hard about what if St. John's were to produce this book 1,000 years ago, what would be the plants and animals they'd have seen that they would have felt the need to put in? Dominic, you had a hand up?
I'm just curious.
I don't remember the exact answer to that with regard to this book. I can tell you that, and I imagine it was the way they would have done it in a medieval context. We know they wrote first. They had to plan to leave gaps for illustrations where they wanted them. So it went from scribe to illuminator. You put the precious metal on first, then to the illustrator who would paint. So it's scribe, illuminator, illustrator, and I assume that this volume followed the same. They didn't come to that accidentally. That somehow worked best that was the best practices, and I'm guessing they probably used the same best practice.
And I have a book on illustrated manuscripts, and that is how they do it. And the book was divided into sections. So first it was written, and then it was the illuminator, then it was the illustrator, and then it was the ruler, and so forth.
Yep. Oh, no. They're all very literate. The only people in the early Middle Ages who were, with the fall of the Roman Empire, again, it's weird. In the Roman Empire, the people who did the scribal work were slaves, but pretty much everyone knew how to write. Not everyone, but literacy was certainly widespread. Fall of the Roman Empire, that ceases to be the case. Education, as they understood it, ceased to function. So much so that by the 16th century, it is still the case that so if you were accused of a crime, you were subject to the law penalties that a common law court might impose on you in England, which could include being hanged from the neck until dead. If you were, however, a member of the clergy, you kind of had a get out of that free card because you were subject now to the discipline of the church. And the worst the church could do to an ordained clergyman was to defrock them. So this is a way to not get hanged if you were convicted of a crime, is if you could plead benefit of clergy. Oh, I'm not like those other people. I'm in the clergy. Well, how did you prove that? You could read. According to the Middle Ages law, if they would give you a literacy test, and if you could read, it meant that you must be clergy because only the clergy could read. But part of training for being a clergyman was being able to read, and so literacy was part of your training. It'd be almost impossible, God, to think about copying and not even knowing what the squiggles mean.
That would be a
mistake rate would be
torture.
enormous.
That would be total torture in that case.
Can you go back, because I didn't know anything about what this was, what we're doing.
Yeah.
Can you go back and give a little brief?
Yep.
Why are we doing this? How did this come about?
So when they produced the St. John's Bible, they didn't produce it just so they could have this masterpiece to leave in a vault or stick in a museum. They produced it so that they could produce high quality copies of it so that the world could see it. And so they have a program where churches like ours and other institutions can receive a volume for the year so that they can share it not only with their community within their church, but within the community at large around them during that year. And they offer some guidance on how you could use it in your space, but we'll be creating some of our own materials. We have our own ideas about how we're going to use it. We'd like to be able to create some field trips, bring in school kids to come and see it.
You've been seeing the images from this for a few years. As one of the sort of side benefits of waiting for a while to bring the actual volume here was we still have license for this time to use the images at will. So you've been seeing these in Crossroads and occasionally in the pamphlets we get for the holy days. Some of these images may be familiar to you if you've been paying attention, but that's
been a sneak peek of this sneak peek.
The idea is to share this, and I'm hoping that we will find ways to make this a community endeavor. I'm very eager to get field trips with children in here to see and to handle. Can we do the last slide? I want to make sure we get to it just because it's such a cool example of the kind of work they were doing.
Yeah, but first let's just make sure we've answered that question well.
So when did they create the manuscript?
I forget exactly what year they started, but it's through the 80s and the 90s into the aughts. It took years. Even with multiple scribes, it took a long time.
And the original is in a vault as we said.
Unbound, by the way.
Unbound.
They haven't bound it yet.
So if you, like, we got to go in the vault. That
Yeah.
was really cool. They brought a few pages out so that we could look at it. We could see the way that the ink from the back page bleeds through a little bit onto the page you're looking at. And then when they decided, you know, that it was done and it was time to make copies of it, it mirrors this way in which creativity led to innovation in materials 1,000 years ago. This led to innovation in printing, paper making.
Yep.
And then the thing that they had to do was, how do we create that bleed through from the other page?
Yeah.
So that when you're staring at this book, you believe you're staring at a page of vellum. So they had to figure that out. So, you know, they experimented as they were printing it. Before they did that, they printed it and they said, we're not getting that bleed through. How do we do that? So that had to happen to understand how to do that. All of these
And the
things.
gold, to make the gold look like gold on a print,
And
so
new-
that it glittered.
A new color.
Yeah.
You know, so like your printer at home has, 3 cartridges in it? So they created new colors that had never been printed before. New machinery, all of these things, and I don't remember the exact number of sets that they made, but there is a finite number of the sets. And then if you go online, you can find lesser quality reproductions of it, coffee table books, larger than coffee table, but the actual Heritage Edition is very limited. And they have a set that they loan out of the Gospels. And there was, I think, a generous gift here that allowed for us to bring it. And so we're going to enjoy it, learn from it, be inspired.
I was at Grace Church in Lexington, Virginia, and they had the Bible there. Does it travel around? And is it
No.
there for a short
No.
period of time?
The printed volume, the prints.
The real one.
The real one, as far as I know, does not travel.
The real one is in a vault.
It's also not a thing yet. It's again, unbound. So you're looking at sheets of parchment. They haven't bound it because in order to reproduce it, they needed to leave it unbound. And if they do want to loan some to a museum or take them on the road, it's easier to transport 3 sheets of vellum than it is to travel with a 7-volume, enormously heavy, by the way,
And priceless.
and priceless, irreplaceable.
Yeah. So we're getting the copy that you saw there, we will get the same quality copy. It will be very hard to distinguish between it and the original.
They might have had a vellum, or a couple of sheets of vellum, but the whole thing does not travel because it would be very unwieldy to have hundreds of sheets of vellum travel.
Jim?
Related question, so do we have the franchise for Wayne County? Or how many other churches in southeastern Michigan are gonna purchase or do this?
As far as we know, us.
I think it's open to
It's-
anyone who,
It's been in other churches. It's been
Yeah.
traveling around for a while now.
I think Drew had it out in Colorado, didn't he? The cathedral there?
Well, I took a picture of it in Lexington, Virginia. So that's why I was wondering.
Well, show it to me when we're done, and we'll talk. Show me when we're done, and we'll talk about it some more.
Well, I'll show you that.
Yeah. Matt, you had your hand up?
Yeah, talking about off subject, where did the Book of Kells set on the world? The Irish Book of Kells, is that a manuscript there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Book of Kells is early Middle Ages. There was a huge scribal, among the most innovative scribal traditions during the era of manuscript were, we think of them as separate places today, but they didn't at the time, Ireland, Scotland, Northern England, which were all of sort of an Irish evangelical missionary community. So the Book of Kells, so-called, was produced at Iona, a monastery in Iona, and they moved it out of Iona because the Vikings were coming through. The Vikings didn't care at all about the word. What they cared about was often there's gold in it. It looks like gold, and by this time the book itself had become a precious object. So often they were bound in gold or silver. That's what the Vikings were after. But as a result, if you want to preserve this, You've got to, they had to get it away from where the Vikings were, where it was vulnerable to Viking raids. And so they took it from Iona to the monastery at Kells, which also was subject to Viking raids, but they escaped out of there with the. These things are rare because I told my kids when they were learning to read, the Codex is a miracle in its way. It is vulnerable to fire and water and bugs and people. And yet, if with a little bit of luck, you can keep things preserved for 1,000 years or 2,000 years. And sometimes books are lucky and they make it. Kells was special enough that that book survived, but it didn't survive without a great deal of effort. I want to make sure we get to this slide before we just because it's one of the beginning of the Psalms. So this is the book, the illustration you see beginning the Psalms. You see the gold squiggles that run from the left to the right side, and they actually run across the illustrations as well. Technology of illumination, using gold and silver leaf, platinum at times, to make something more precious and special and glowing. That technology is hundreds and hundreds of years old. But that squiggle is also illumination. It's just very thin lines squiggling back and forth, but not just lines. This is unbelievably cool. The St. John's monks, and it is a monastery, they're monks, they chant the Psalms. They actually sing the Psalms. They recorded them singing the Psalms with an oscilloscope. So they have a visual image of what those sound waves look like. They illuminated that into the book. So as you're looking at the book of Psalms, those illuminated squiggles, those gold lines are actually the sound waves of the St. John's monks chanting the Psalms. And it's metal, which means that there's devices that can read that squiggle back into sound waves. There's a recording of the monks chanting the Psalms embedded in the page in gold. The monks in the 13th century were not doing that. So again, there's a lot of real innovation here. Why go to the trouble of producing a manuscript Bible in the 21st century? It's still a prayer. It's still devotion. It's still a sacrificial act of labor, but it's also a really exciting way to think about the Bible and the Word of God. And they were trying to be very, they were deliberately reaching back 1,500 years, but they were also reaching forward 1,500 years. In 500 years, someone can hear the St. John's monks chanting those Psalms, if they care to. That's unbelievable.
The monks who created the first manuscripts. And we've heard about the servant nature of the people that created the St. John's Bible. It is still a secret who paid for it. So someone with a servant heart decided to fund this project. And it is like completely under wraps who it is. So to think that to have the ability to be this creative and to have the backing and the financial support so that you didn't have to say, well, we can only be so creative because there's a limit. But they were given the go-ahead to just fully express themselves through the creation of the St. John's Bible. But it's just a remarkable gift. And to think that at the Abbey, they talk about this building won't be here in 1,000 years. But we pray that this book will. It's pretty amazing. Couple questions. We have one back there and then Helen.
I have not. It's a printed Bible. It's the first printed book. Johannes Gutenberg happened to be the first book he produced was a Bible. Some on parchment, some on paper. There were probably 200 copies originally. There's about 45, I think, that survive. It was in Latin. Yep, Vulgate Bible. And by that time, even manuscript culture had long slipped the bounds of the monastery. By the time you get universities in the 11th century, there begins to be a market for books that is not just the Word of God. And so by the 12th, 13th century, Oxford had a street, Cat Street, where there were scribes and illuminators and illustrators and bookbinders and parchment makers. And yeah, they were producing the Word of God at times, missals and books of hours, but they were also producing natural histories and books of rhetoric for the university. It had become more of a trade industry. Really?
Yes, Helen said that. Yes, so Helen got to sing with the chorale in the chapel at Iona.
I also saw two seagulls mug a couple of people for their ice cream cone.
You don't have to go to Iona to see that.
Yes, lofty things and lowly things, right?
Any port town in Britain. Yeah.
Physically, where is this Bible here?
We don't have it yet. I don't know where it's going to be kept.
We are going to decide that, but it will be viewable. It's not going to be locked up in a vault. That's not the purpose of bringing it, to just lock it up and only tell you about it. And it's arriving here for Advent this year. And when it arrives, that weekend, we'll have a workshop for docents, people who are interested in having a deeper dive into it. They'll learn some of the things we learned when we went out to the Abbey. And they'll be part of sharing the beauty of this with the community. And then that Sunday, probably Brad Neary, one of the representatives, will do a presentation at Forum about, in greater detail than we can, about it. Then we will experience it together for a year. They'll send another person out to do another presentation on it, probably that following fall, or maybe later in the spring. So it's, we get it for a year. And we hope that everybody has the opportunity, and avails themselves of the opportunity to get to see and handle it themselves.
It's not the priceless manuscript, so you want to be careful of it, but it's not the thing that is priceless and unique. All manuscripts are unique. And I deal with much more modest manuscripts on a yearly basis for my research. Government papers, accounts of a project, things that were handwritten that were saved for whatever reason. These are manuscripts too. Every one of them is unique, and they're not going to interlibrary loan it. And so, yeah, every time I handle one of these things, this is a unique item in the world that produces knowledge that may not exist anywhere else, and never will again if it disappears. So we're not getting that, but we are getting a really cool version of that gets you as close as they could physically get to that experience, right down to, as Maureen pointed out, you can just barely make out the ink on the other side of the page, even though they had to print that ink on the front side of the page to create that illusion. Colleen?
There is also a video on how they did that, and I'll include it. It's really cool. They did it. It was in Minnesota. They found a printer in Minnesota. Did they create it?
I don't remember where they were, but yeah, I think they did. They found a relatively local printer that was able to work with them.
Jackson was there, like, micromanaging the entire thing.
He is a micromanager.
Yeah, there is a video on how they recreated it.
Yes, we'll send you guys those things so that you can begin to take a look. Our purpose today, though, was to just kind of start to wet your whistle for some things that are coming to a church near you in what is actually just a few months, as strange as it seems. It's April this week. Crazy, right? Do you have a last word for us, Eric?
I don't. I'm happy to stick around for a little while if folks have more questions. I appreciate your patience. This is an extremely neat thing that we're getting. Take some opportunity to engage with it, to look at the images, to learn more about the process. This has been fun, but it's a poor simulacrum of what we were treated to on this retreat to Minnesota. That's a bigger question than we should.
Yeah, that is a big question.
I don't.
Stay tuned.
Some of this we don't know yet.
It is in process.
Yeah.
Yeah. Father Drew, do you have anything you'd like to add to the conversation? Because this didn't begin with me. So I didn't show up and say, you know what we need to do? We need to bring the St. John's Bible. This began before I got here. So do you have something you'd like to add about how this came into being for us?
Well, I missed the very beginning of your talk this morning, but I think the thing that stands out for me about the St. John's Bible is the desire from St. John's Abbey and then the whole team of creators for it to present the Word of God, the good news of God's love in a beautiful and engaging way for the world. All of it is its ultimate purpose is not to present a beautiful book, but to present the story of God's love in a way that the world might engage it again today. And so if we can be part of that, if we can, I think all that Eric was just saying for us to engage it, for us to touch it, to see it, to look at it as a way for us to deepen our connection to the good news of God. If we can invite others to come and see something that they may not otherwise be all that intrigued by, they may not be taking too seriously, but this might be a way to kindle some thought within their heart. That's the purpose of the St. John's Bible. It's not merely to be a beautiful book, but more importantly, to be a beautiful word for the world.
They could have done the Aeneid or the Iliad, and that would have been an amazing project. But that isn't what they did. They did the Bible, and that goes all the way back to the beginning of this whole process.
Yeah. So, well, I think we're good. So thank you, Eric. Because what's next week? Oh, the train station with Mark Higbee. So do come and learn all about all the cool, innovative things that have happened with the train station.